Something unusual is happening in the world of computing right now, and most people haven't fully realized it yet. For decades, the tech industry followed a predictable path. Big companies defined the experience, users adapted to it, and innovation moved in carefully controlled steps. But quietly, almost underneath the surface, Linux has crossed a line that changes everything. Not just for developers, not just for enthusiasts, but for everyday users, creators, businesses, and even the giants that once seemed untouchable. And the most surprising part is this: it's a line that Apple, with all its power and control, simply cannot follow. To understand why this matters, you have to look at what Linux used to be. For years, Linux was seen as the alternative. It was powerful, yes, but also intimidating. It was flexible, but fragmented. It gave users freedom, but often at the cost of convenience. Meanwhile, companies like Apple built their entire identity on controlled ecosystems. Everything was polished, seamless, and tightly integrated. Hardware and software worked together perfectly, but only within the boundaries Apple allowed. That trade-off became normal. If you wanted simplicity, you gave up control. If you wanted control, you accepted complexity. But that balance has started to break. Linux is no longer just an alternative operating system. It's evolving into something much bigger, a platform that combines freedom and usability in a way that was once thought impossible. Modern Linux distributions are no longer just functional. They are refined, visually appealing, and increasingly user-friendly. The experience gap that once existed between Linux and commercial operating systems has narrowed dramatically, and in some areas, Linux is now ahead. What makes this shift so significant is not just technical improvement, it's philosophical. Linux is built on openness. Anyone can modify it, distribute it, reshape it. That means innovation doesn't come from a single company. It comes from thousands of contributors across the world. This creates a kind of evolution that no closed system can replicate. It's faster, more diverse, and often more responsive to real user needs. Apple, on the other hand, operates in a completely different way. Its strength lies in control. Every decision is centralized. Every feature is carefully curated. That's what allows Apple to create products that feel cohesive and predictable. But it also means Apple cannot move in the same direction as Linux without fundamentally changing its identity. And that's the line Linux has crossed, a point where openness itself becomes the advantage. Think about how computing is changing right now. We're no longer just using desktops and laptops in isolation. We're working across devices, across cloud systems, across platforms. Flexibility is becoming more important than uniformity. Users want systems that adapt to them, not systems that force them into predefined workflows. Linux thrives in this environment because it was designed for flexibility from the very beginning. Another factor driving this shift is performance and efficiency. Linux has always been known for its ability to run on almost anything, from powerful servers to tiny embedded devices. But now that efficiency is becoming a major advantage, even on high-end systems. As software grows more demanding and hardware becomes more complex, the ability to optimize and customize at a deep level becomes incredibly valuable. Linux allows that in ways that closed systems simply do not. There's also the growing importance of privacy and control over data. Users are becoming more aware of how their information is collected, stored, and used. In a closed ecosystem, you're trusting a company to handle that responsibility. In an open system like Linux, you have visibility. You can see what's happening, you can change it if you want. That level of transparency is becoming more attractive as concerns about digital privacy continue to rise. But perhaps the most important change is happening in the tools people use every day. For a long time, one of the biggest barriers to Linux adoption was software compatibility. Popular applications were often unavailable, and alternatives didn't always measure up. That's no longer the case. The rise of cross-platform applications, web-based tools, and compatibility layers has dramatically reduced that gap. Many users can now switch to Linux without losing access to the tools they rely on. Gaming, once considered impossible on Linux, has seen a massive transformation. Compatibility technologies have made it possible to run a huge library of games with performance that rivals or even exceeds other platforms. This is a clear example of how Linux is no longer just catching up, it's redefining expectations. Developers, too, are driving this momentum. Linux has always been strong in development environments, but now it's becoming the default choice for many workflows. From cloud computing to artificial intelligence, Linux is at the center of innovation. When the people building the future choose a platform, that platform gains an incredible advantage. It shapes the tools, the standards, and the direction of the entire industry. And then there's the hardware side of things. For years, Apple's biggest advantage was its tight integration between hardware and software. That's still true to an extent, but the gap is closing. More hardware manufacturers are embracing Linux, improving compatibility, and even designing devices specifically for it. This means users are no longer limited to a narrow set of options. They can choose hardware that fits their needs and run an operating system that adapts to it. This is where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Apple's ecosystem is powerful, but it's also restrictive. You get a carefully designed experience, but you're locked into it. Linux offers the opposite: freedom to customize, freedom to choose, freedom to experiment. For a long time, that freedom came with trade-offs. Now, those trade-offs are disappearing. The line Linux has crossed is the point where freedom and usability are no longer mutually exclusive. It's the moment when an open system becomes not just viable, but desirable for mainstream users. And that creates a challenge that Apple cannot easily solve. Because to compete with that level of openness, Apple would have to give up the very control that defines its brand. This doesn't mean Apple is going anywhere. Its ecosystem is still incredibly strong, and for many users, it offers exactly what they want. But the landscape is changing. The dominance of closed systems is no longer guaranteed. Users now have real alternatives that don't require compromise. Looking ahead, the implications are enormous. As more people adopt Linux, the ecosystem will continue to grow. More developers will create software for it, more hardware will support it, more innovations will emerge from it. This creates a feedback loop that accelerates its progress even further. At the same time, the definition of computing itself is evolving. We're moving toward a world where devices are interconnected, where workflows are fluid, where customization is expected rather than optional. In that world, the advantages of an open system become even more significant. What's happening right now isn't just a shift in operating systems, it's a shift in power. For decades, control was concentrated in the hands of a few companies. They decided how computing worked, and users adapted. Linux represents a different model, one where users and developers have a direct role in shaping the experience. That's why this moment matters. It's not about Linux replacing Apple or any other company. It's about changing the rules of the game. It's about proving that a different approach to computing is not only possible, but competitive at the highest level. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back. Because when users experience a system that gives them both power and simplicity, both freedom and stability, they start to expect it. They start to demand it, and that expectation spreads across the industry. Companies that rely on closed ecosystems will have to adapt, but there are limits to how far they can go without losing what makes them unique. That's the position Apple finds itself in. It can evolve, it can innovate, but it cannot fully embrace the openness that defines Linux without fundamentally changing its identity. So the future of computing isn't about one platform winning over another. It's about a broader shift toward flexibility, transparency, and user empowerment. Linux is at the forefront of that shift, not because it followed the traditional path, but because it created its own. And now that it has crossed this line, the rest of the industry has to respond. Because the expectations have changed, the possibilities have expanded, and the future of computing will never look the same again.